there are many different ways to give, but I think it's important that we always teach the grace of giving. You see, Paul tells us that there's 4 different things we need to do. First, he says we need to give in spite of circumstances. We need to give in spite of our circumstances. When I was 8 years old, I had been asking my parents for an allowance. And my parents weren't very wealthy, and they didn't want to do that. So my grandfather, his name was Grandpa Scooby. Now, the reason his name was Grandpa Scooby is because he was a 6'7" Lithuanian, and when I was a little teeny baby, he used to hold me up in the air and say, "Scooby, Scooby, Scooby-Doo." And I was the first grandchild, so I got to name him, and he was Grandpa Scooby. And Grandpa Scooby came to me one Saturday, and he said, "Look, I know you've been looking to get an allowance, so I'm going to start giving you $1 a week starting next week, but you got to make sure you do all your chores to get that $1." And I said, "Yes, sir, Grandpa, sir, I'll make sure I do all those chores." And the following Saturday came around, and Grandpa Scooby came over, and he gave me 90 cents. And I said, "Hey, Grandpa, I thought I was going to get an allowance of $1. He said, "You do, I'm just holding back the tithe for you." He was a good Lutheran, and he said, "I'll put that in the offering plate for you until you learn how to do that." Now, that was a very valuable lesson for me, because even in my little teeny itty-bitty dollar allowance, I learned the value of giving in spite of circumstances. You see, generosity is not dependent on bank balance. Paul says the trial exposed their true colors. They were incredibly happy, though desperately poor. The pressure triggered something totally unexpected, an outpouring of pure and generous gifts. You see, the value of your gift is not determined by the amount of your gift. I'm going to say that again. The value of your gift is not determined by the amount of your gift. Y'all remember the story that the story about Jesus being in the synagogue, and all these rich guys were coming up and putting their big piles of money in the offering plate, and then a little old lady came and put in 2 cents, and he said, "Truly I say unto you, her gift is the greatest of all, because she gave out of her poverty while the others gave out of their wealth." The value of your gift is not determined by the amount of your gift. We're called to give in spite of circumstances. In fact, I think some of the best giving comes at the most difficult time. Second thing Paul tells us is that we are to give enthusiastically. We're to give enthusiastically. You see, the amazing thing about giving is generosity is contagious. It catches on. Remember last year when we heard about those kids who live in the woods and how they're struggling to get by every day, and they have to be careful because they can't leave anything in the woods, and they have to shower at school and all that kind of stuff. We took a special offering to put together backpacks for these kids that would have toiletries so that they could take them with them to school and not have to worry that they were going to be stolen while they were in the woods. We thought, jeepers, if we do really good, we could probably raise about $1,000. We ended raising, $2,500 or $3,000? More money than we ever would have thought. And that money is still being used to good service today, buying toiletries and putting together backpacks so that these kids will have the bare necessities of life. That giving was contagious. And it's the same way with the rest. Paul says, "I was there and saw it for myself. They gave offerings of whatever they could, far more than they could afford, pleading for the privilege of helping out in the relief of poor Christians." You know, it does our heart good to be involved in giving. And when we do it enthusiastically, we experience even that much more joy, because generosity is in response to God's grace. If when the offering plate goes by, you kind of go, you're giving with the wrong motive. Generosity should be in response to the gracious gifts that God has given you. And I'm not just talking about salvation and pie in the sky when you die by and by. I'm talking about the blessings that we have each and every day. You know, I was going to put a picture on the thing. There are 220 inches of snow that fell at Lake Tahoe over the last month. That's like 20 feet of snow. I don't know about you, but I haven't had to shovel any of that lately around here. We are greatly blessed to live in this place. God has been gracious to us, and we're supposed to give in response to God's grace. Now, there was a guy I know, his name's George Zofson, and George Zofson was very successful in the business world. He worked for Xerox. He was one of their corporate vice presidents, and George got kind of sick of the corporate life, and so at the age of 40, he quit his job to start his own company. And about the same time he quit his job, he found his way to my home church, Fair Oaks Presbyterian Church. And George got himself saved. And George got himself fired up, and George got himself going. And I remember I was helping out at the new members class when George became a member of the church. And he decided when they passed out the commitment cards that he was going to make a commitment of $20,000 for that year. He said, I'm going to commit $20,000 because I think in my first year of business, I'll make $200,000 and I want to tithe. Well, at the end of the year, George made $400,000. And so the next year, George said, I think I'm going to make $500,000 next year, so I'm going to pledge $50,000 to the church because I want to tithe. At the end of the second year, George made $1 million that year. And George came into my office. I was the doofy little junior high minister, but George and I had struck up a friendship. And he came into my office and he was crying. And I said, George, what's wrong? He said, I'm trying really hard, but I can't outgive God. You see, our gifts need to be in response to God's grace. And then Paul says we need to give willingly. It needs to not be a trial. It needs to not be work for us. Because the amazing thing is, I don't know about you, but my wife calls me Even Steven. Every time we get a escrow refund check or something in the mail for $200, the very next day we get an unexpected bill for $200. And every time we get an unexpected bill for $300, the very next day somehow we end up with a check for $300. We're just Even Steven. And it works that way for all of us, I believe, because if we try to outgive God, He's going to make up for it. Now, He may not make up for it in the bank book. He may make up for it in a whole lot of other ways. But we need to give willingly because generosity motivates us to deeper service. You see, when you're connected to the ministries of this church through your giving, it motivates you to get a little more involved. Paul says, here's what I think. The best thing you can do right now is to finish what you started last year and not let those good intentions grow stale. Your heart's been in the right place all along. You've got what it takes to finish up, so go to it. One of the things we discovered this year in our record keeping is that those who have made pledges in our church are pretty far behind. I hope that you'll catch up with those because we got bills we got to pay. But also generosity exemplifies our deeper service. Paul said, once the commitment is clear, you can do what you can, not what you can't. The heart regulates the hands. The heart regulates the hands. There is so much that God does for us. We need to make sure that we are regulated by our hearts. The fourth thing that Paul says is that we give by faith. We give by faith. The best way to do your giving is not to look backwards at last month. It's to look forwards at the future. Because I'm convinced that the more generous we are with God, the more generous God is with us. And Paul tells us that generosity works as a team. It isn't so that others can take it easy while you sweat it out. No, you're shoulder to shoulder with them all the way. This church works together to do amazing things. I think I've told you 100 times before about my church in Folsom, California that I worked at. We had 2 billionaires in the congregation. It was the worst thing that ever happened to that church, because at the end of the financial year, whatever the deficit was, everybody in the church would look right to those 2 guys. And wonderfully or tragically, between the 2 of them, they always took care of the deficit. Wonderfully, because it allowed the church to continue. Terribly, because the church began to depend on them. Bob Pepper was worth about $1.5 billion, and Ron Middlestead, who you could look up on the stock exchange, he has a company called Waste Solutions. He's worth about $7 or $8 billion. And then a tragedy happened at Folsom Presbyterian Church. Ron decided it was a better tax advantage to move his company to Texas. And the church lost half of their billionaires. And they had to make up for it themselves. Now, do we have any billionaires in our congregation? We need to work together as a team. And I don't care what the size of your gift is. I care about what the size of your heart is. We need to work together as a team, and we also need to understand that generosity trusts God to fill all our needs. God is going to take care of us. He's going to take care of you. And the more generous you are, and I'm not just talking about giving of your dollars, I'm talking about how generous you are with the people around you, with your time and your talent and your attention. If we give generously, God will fill all of our needs. Your surplus matching their deficit, their surplus matching your deficit. In the end, you come out even. See, even Paul says we're all even, Stephen. And the finality of all of this is that generosity focuses us on the gospel. Paul says we're sending a companion along with Titus, someone very popular in the churches for his preaching of the message. We're not just fundraisers around here. We're doing this for a reason. And the purpose is the gospel. The purpose is spreading Jesus' love. Now, that comes in a whole lot of different forms. That comes from feeding the hungry in our community, offering a bicycle, having free clothes for folks who need to have a nice set of clothes so that they can take a job interview. The tragedy is that along with all of those nice ministries, we still have bills to pay. We got to pay the air conditioning bill. We got to pay our employees. We even got to pay those pastors. Rats. But if we give by faith, if we work as a team, if we understand that God is going to fill all our needs, this generosity stuff is pretty easy. Now, every time I preach one of these dollar sermons, I usually get 2 or 3 nasty emails saying, "Hey, you don't need to talk about money all that much." Good news is, it was right in the Bible this week. I didn't even have to do nothing special. I wrote this sermon back in August, or at least the outline for it. But it's part of who we are as Christians. Jesus said, "They will know we are Christians by..." We need to exemplify that love. So be generous, people, not just with the offering plate. Be generous in your love for others. Because when you do, you'll find out you're even Stephen, and you'll get as much love back or even more.